So we now move to the next part of our evening, which is a discussion with 6 experts whose institutions have been busy addressing challenges of undernutrition and malnutrition. And they've all agreed to give us short, sharp updates of where their institutions and sectors are in that progress since last year. And they've agreed also to answer questions in the session that follows. So I'm going to ask them all up to the stage here, not in any particular order, but I'll tell you who they are. So please, could our panelists please come up? We've got some microphones there, which they can all share in presentations. Our panelists include Arti Odisha, the head of Department of Women and Child Development in Odisha State in India. Elizabeth Kimani, who's an associate research scientist at the African Population Health Research Council in Nairobi. Nick Dyer, who's a Director General for Policy and Global Programs at DFID. Joe Cerrell, the Managing Director of Global Policy and Advocacy at the Gates Foundation. Michael Anderson, the Chief Executive Officer of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and Tom Arnold, who is Concern Worldwide's Special Representative for Hunger. So thank you for all coming. And I'm going to start the panel comments with the donors who've made these commitments a year ago and ask them each to tell us a bit about where they're at and where they're going with that. So we'll just have that series of presentations and then the questions will come later. So Nick, can I begin with you? Have you got a microphone? Great. You're DFID's Director General for Policy and Global Programs. Last year, DFID committed to triple its investment in nutrition up to 2020. And you made a strong case then for the role of business in tackling undernutrition as well. How are you getting on with these commitments? And what are your priorities for the coming year?
Thanks very much, Jeff. And thanks very much for Srinath, particularly for laying out and John for laying out the challenge, which is exactly the reason why we did the event last year. And from a personal perspective, for somebody who's been working in international development for 25 years, it's only the last 4 or 5 that really we've been, certainly in DFID, addressing nutrition. And that just shows, it's just an illustration about how much of a sort of orphan this has been for many years. Which I think is why, from our perspective, the event last year was A, so important, B, to some extent a success. Now, why do I say to some extent a success? Because if you go to places like Zambia, which I did in December last year, it's quite clear that here we have a country that is growing rapidly, is now lower middle income status, but still has 45% of its children stunted. And this is hard, and the reality is that this is going to require a long-term effort to make a difference and to sustain the momentum. So how are we getting on? I could give you a long list of all the programs that we started afresh. So we've started 9 new programs on nutrition. I could tell you all about the business engagement we've been doing. But let me tell you the 3 things I think we need going forward to sustain the momentum. So 3 things we need: advocacy, delivery, and accountability. So in terms of advocacy, last week I was in Toronto dealing in an event on maternal and child deaths. And the good thing about that event was it's talked about the importance of nutrition. This is starting to get traction, but we need to continue in terms of getting engaged and integrated into the post-MDGs. We need to get the ICN2 to be a success next year. And we are absolutely delighted to be working with the Brazilian government, who we'll hear from later, in terms of taking forward this agenda into the Rio Olympics in 2 years' time. Advocacy, delivery, we've got to show that we can change the facts on the ground. If we can't change the facts on the ground, we're actually not going to sustain the support for this agenda. And thirdly, in terms of accountability, I think, Lawrence, your report is terrific. It may be difficult, we may not have the right data, but this has got to be the starting point. We've got to actually show and highlight what the challenges are and bring them to life and actually tell the political leaders and show the political leaders what the challenge is, because until we do that, then they're not going to take this agenda seriously. And until they do that, they're not going to actually invest in terms of their own domestic resources in terms of putting it into nutrition. So advocacy, delivery, accountability. If we get those three right, we're going to sustain this momentum.
Thank you, Nick. Michael, as the new CEO of CIFF, and with your earlier experience as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on the post-2015 development agenda, what do you feel are the key challenges and opportunities ahead for achieving nutrition targets and commitments, and what role do you see CIFF playing in that?
Thanks, Jeff. Actually, a pretty soft question. You could have asked a much harder one, so thank you. Look, I think that there are four things, which I just want to highlight quickly. I agree with the challenge laid out by Lawrence, which I thought was incredibly compelling, and I agree also with the main points Nick's just made. But so four simple points. One of them is increasing the amount of money that goes to nutrition is going to be a necessary but not sufficient condition. We know that's important, but we need to do things that are not entirely new. We can work more diagonally and in more cross-sectoral ways. So using antenatal care platforms to deliver iron and folic acid supplements to pregnant women, for example, isn't happening enough. We're not doing enough to use community health workers and agriculture extension workers to help screen for severe acute malnutrition, for example. So I think there are a lot of things where we can take advantage of existing delivery platforms. That's one thing. I think we need to be smarter about that. The second thing we know, which has already been mentioned, senior level commitment really matters, but not just for politicians, but for officials and for business leaders. I think there's some terrific examples. Rwanda's national emergency plan to eliminate malnutrition. Of course, people say, well, it would be Rwanda, wouldn't it? But it has been an amazing success, a lot more to go. But the multi-sectoral coordination across ministries has seen stunting rates cut by almost 10% in 5 years, which is a really impressive achievement. On the senior commitment, I think there's a key message that this audience and the global panel have to help get out, which is in March in Ahuja, I was talking to a group of ministers, mainly finance ministers from the African Union. And every time I mentioned nutrition as a problem, they all had one answer, which is food. And kind of the simple idea that enough to eat solves nutrition by itself is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we have to overcome. And Srinath and John and others, I'm looking to you to help make sure that that message is challenged. Because as long as people, senior leaders, are able to think that growing more maize is going to do it by itself, we're not going to get there. And that is a very widespread view. My third point, very briefly, is innovation is important. I believe in innovation. CIFF's going to invest in innovation. But there is a risk that innovation is overrated. And there's a risk that what's underrated is just execution, execution, execution. Get on with it. Much of what needs to be done is not rocket science. Lawrence has already mentioned the terrific example of Maharashtra. Maharashtra did nothing that was hugely innovative. It just got down and paid attention to management and delivered. My last point, others have talked about, but accountability and measurement and data. Really do think this is going to be the thing which is going to help drive ownership, it's going to help drive execution, it's going to help drive the cross-platform delivery. Really pleased that Lawrence and others are working on this, but it's a big contribution to make. So I'll stop at that, Jeff.
Thanks, Michael. Joe, last year the Gates Foundation committed $800 million in nutrition-related activities, particularly in breastfeeding, I think, and scientific research. Could you update us on where you are with that and where you're going next year?
Yeah, and thanks to you for hosting this great event, along with DFID, CIFF, and the Brazilian Embassy. The Gates Foundation made a commitment last year, $862.7 million, of which a big portion of that was to nutrition-specific, but also nutrition-sensitive programs. And I think for us, we have ourselves been much more committed to thinking about what are the ways we can better integrate nutrition into some of our health and agriculture programs. Those are two areas where we had a lot more activity going, and this was a very good galvanizing moment for us to also take stock on ways that we can sensitize ourselves to really incorporating nutrition into the way that we work. As Bill Gates said, in the first 1,000 days of life, it's so critical to make sure that you address some of the nutrition-related needs of children, that no matter the interventions that you provide, whether in education or in health, if you miss that first 1,000 days, you really lost the potential of that child from achieving their full capacity. So we see it as increasingly a much more important part of the way that we're thinking about some of our health and our agriculture work. Towards that commitment, we've started to ramp up from our 2012 spending. Indicates 115 million in new spending on nutrition, 80 million of which is to nutrition-specific interventions, and the rest towards nutrition-sensitive. And so we are seeing already an upward trajectory, and are very confident in the 2013 spending, when those numbers become available. You'll see that increasingly that we're making progress, and very confident we'll achieve the 2020 objectives that we've set for ourselves. We've seen some remarkable progress. One effort that my colleagues were very eager to call out is Alive and Thrive, a $20 million investment that we made over the last 5 years, where we're seeing dramatic progress in a relatively short period of time. Between 2009 and 2014, Alive and Thrive has reached more than 16 million children under the age of 2 in countries including Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Vietnam, with a tripling in Vietnam of children reach on exclusive breastfeeding and improved complementary feeding practices. So we've chosen to extend a second phase of that program. We're very excited about that. But I would say that for us, moments like this are incredibly important and not to be underestimated. When the world can really come together and put an issue like nutrition on the map. I mean, CIFF in particular and DFID are to be commended. I mean, really hats off to both for really driving this agenda forward, getting donors like us to go through the process of thinking how sensitive are we to nutrition within our own programs. And really it's a helpful exercise, even though sometimes they're often very painstaking in going through, that really does galvanize the community and galvanizes the conversations and dialogues needed. So I'd say, to sum it up, for us, integration is going to be key in the future. We haven't done as good a job, I would say, at the Gates Foundation, really incorporating agriculture and nutrition. Now they're part of the same program in global development for us. They sit very close to one another. They talk a lot more, and it seems like a no-brainer, but for us, it took a while, and I think this effort has been really helpful in us to better integrate ag nutrition and increasingly other health priorities into a common continuum. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Tom, can I turn to you? As Concerned Worldwide's Special Representative for Hunger, you also have a strong impression of civil society commitment to nutrition goals. So could you share some thoughts on how you feel civil society is getting on with the commitments they made, and how the UK NGO community, which made such a contribution to Nutrition for Growth last year, is forging a global network for action?
Okay, I'm certainly glad to do that, but I think that it's the wider context, a brief word on first. What Lauren said about momentum here is of critical importance, because we have momentum now for the variety of reasons that he says. It has to be sustained and built upon. The two things we heard about earlier, the global panel and the global report, each can make an important contribution to building that momentum. I have to say, in an audience like this, backing up what Joe said, British government's leadership role here over the past number of years has been absolutely vital, and I hope it continues, as the same comment applies for DFID. It's been absolutely crucial. Now, when we get specifically to civil society, one of the big parts of this momentum in the past few years is the Sun movement. We now have over 50 countries signed up to the Sun from a standing start in 2010. And within the Sun, the critically important factor of the role of civil society. There is a civil society network as part of the Sun. It was established, its inaugural meeting took place in Washington on the 11th of June last year, just 3 days after the meeting here. And now there are 800 civil societies make up that network. So it's an impressive body of people. And the key purpose of this, is to encourage the alignment of civil society organisations, strategies, programmes and resources with the country plans for scaling up nutrition. And that's of really major importance. And the building of civil society alliances in these countries is also important. And last year, the number of civil society alliances have risen from 11 to 30. So that means almost half of over 60% of Sun countries have civil society alliances. We're also beginning to see twinning, sharing of experiences between different countries of what's happening under Sun. That's really important for CSOs as well. And this week, just on the 4th of June in DFID offices, there's a technical and policy meetings of the civil society groupings involved in Sun are coming together to share their experiences. So again, it's sharing experiences, it's accountability, it's learning from each other. So I think there's real progress in this area. When you come down to individual countries, there are some very interesting examples. I mean, the fact that Malawi has played such an important role, co-chairs the global panel. Not the global panel, the report is one such example, and just a very brief examples of what's happening in Malawi, for example. There's something called the Civil Society Organisation Nutrition Alliance, SONA, and what it and its members have been involved in a review of national nutrition policy as well as drafting a Nutrition Act. And 5 SONA members have got a grant from the World Bank to facilitate the implementation of a national education and community strategy in 7 districts. And Save the Children are leading a budget analysis as to how nutrition fits into Malawi's budget. So there's a lot of things happening, and I think we have to very much build on that and keep the momentum.
Thank you, Tom. Elizabeth, I'm going to turn to you now. You represent in this panel really the research community, the African Public Health Research Council, and that community has got a particularly important role in delivering improved nutrition agenda and the evidence for it. I'd like to ask you if you wanted to share some thoughts about the role of research and perhaps your own insights on nutrition as an urban as well as a rural issue.
Thank you, Jeff. We've been working a lot on issues of urbanization and child health outcomes, and particularly for this particular panel, I'm talking about nutrition. So we've done a lot of work around nutrition, and we found that their nutritional status amongst children in urban areas is actually, it's very poor compared to even rural areas. For example, like in Kenya, we are talking of the whole of Kenya, we have 35% of children are stunted, but we find that in the slums, in the slums of Nairobi, about over 40% are stunted. So we found that actually the issue of nutrition is no longer a rural issue, but it's actually also an urban issue because of the issue of urbanization, the rapid urbanization which has been happening in sub-Saharan African countries, including Kenya, and where we don't have services amongst in the urban areas. We don't have proper services. So our work has been research and exposing what's happening in urban areas to the government and other policy makers and decision makers. So we've worked very closely with the government, telling them about what our research has found, and also trying to test interventions that would address these poor nutritional outcomes. For example, we also found that feeding practices are very poor. Like, we talk of exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, and only like in the urban slums, we have only 2% of children being exclusively breastfed. So the kind of interventions we are trying out, for example, to do with the breastfeeding, some of the when we did qualitative, when we've done a lot of qualitative work, and we found that women actually have misperceptions about breastfeeding and how the milk production happens, and they say that because they are poor, they don't have food, they actually don't have milk to breastfeed, so they don't breastfeed adequately. So we've started and there is also an issue of childcare practices where women have to work, to start working very early after giving birth, because they don't have other sources of livelihood. They have to start to go to work almost immediately after birth, and so they don't have they can't exclusively breastfeed, and they don't breastfeed for long because of such issues. So we are trying interventions. The first intervention that we are trying out at the moment is having community health workers counsel mothers around breastfeeding, and supporting them during the time of pregnancy and after birth, to see how that improves their infant feeding practices and nutritional outcomes of children. And also we are trying to see, because the issue of women having to go back to work and leaving their children in some substandard healthcare care centers, we also are trying interventions where we want to see whether if you have you improve the status of the child care centers, that would improve on the nutritional status of children. We also want to try other interventions, like we are thinking of maybe things like if you have income generating activities that would allow mothers to breastfeed as they work, whether that could improve the nutritional status of children. So our role has been to actually, because we know the kind of outcomes which are in the urban poor settings, we want to see what interventions can be put in place, and we are working with the government so that they buy into these the results, and they can also scale up some of those interventions that we are coming up with.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now, lastly and not leastly, Arti, we've been talking several times during this meeting about advances in India. Your province of Odisha has shown improvements in child nutrition indicators over the past decade, a notable acceleration, particularly in nutrition of children from socially excluded groups. So I thought perhaps you might be able to finish off our panel comments with some impressions of how that's been achieved, and also your impressions of how what you've heard so far this evening is relevant to the kinds of challenges that you face in Odisha.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm glad you mentioned lastly and not leastly, because one of my professors used to say, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And the implementer is often the nail on which different things are being hammered. And let me tell you a bit about what I do. Odisha is one of the backward states of India, had very high levels of undernutrition, but has shown significant reduction. There have been a number of independent evaluations. We've had social audits, a number of studies which are pan-national and which have shown that there are reductions in stunting as well as undernutrition. I head a department that implements integrated child development services, where we provide supplementary nutrition to about 5 million children across 71,000 centers throughout the state. Every day, we give them a hot cooked meal and a morning snack. Also take home ration for children that are below 3 years, pregnant and lactating women, plus a host of other things like nutrition, health education, and also preschool education. So I'm going to broadly tell you about what we did in Odisha, which I suppose should have worked. The first is system strengthening, because we have a very large base of workers. So system strengthening through increased monitoring, building stronger monitoring and evaluation systems, lot of capacity building in the system, lot of IT-related feedbacks, etc. The second thing is what you mentioned about equity. A lot of evidence suggests that there is a very strong socioeconomic gradient in nutrition. And we have something called the Nutrition Operation Plan, which is funded by the DFID. Apart from that, a number of initiatives, especially for, now we are starting for like the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, which are the most primitive and have very bad indicators. So a lot of focus on equity, and all the data suggests that the uptake of services has been much, much higher in the scheduled tribes, especially in the women, as compared to the general category, which is very heartening. The third initiative is involving communities, because as you can guess, centrally monitoring 71,000 centers on a given day is simply not possible. So people in the village have become our best resources in terms of being the eyes and ears. And they are now involved in the whole issue of nutrition. There are incentives for communities. There are different kinds of initiatives they are taking. And there are mothers groups, there are self-help groups of women. And recently we've started doing a PLA with them, which is again based on evidence. There was a Lancet study which showed how effective it was when you work with women's groups. So that's something we've started. So a lot of community involvement. The next is tackling the 1,000 days, which we have been talking about, because as we all know, after 2 years, it's really not much effective if you give all these interventions. So we are doing that 1,000-day approach, and there's been a huge conditional cash transfer program that's been started in Odisha. We give about 5,000 rupees to each woman starting from the first trimester till the baby is a year old. It's not 1,000 days strictly, and we really need to go beyond that 1 year, and which we are hoping we should be able to. But it's, and the initial data, it's just been about 2 years since it was launched, and initial analysis shows that the process indicators for which we are giving, the conditions for which we are doing the cash transfers, they have had significant improvements, which cover the whole gamut of things like early initiation of breastfeeding, antenatal, postnatal care, IFA tablets, etc., etc. And the last thing, the fifth thing, is of course advocacy and convergence, because without that, most of the gains would not be possible. So we have a nutrition council that's headed by the chief minister of the state, where we have all the departments, and it is our job, my department's job, to push for the agenda that we have and achieve the convergence across different departments. And now we are thinking of setting up a secretariat for that mission, which is able to coordinate between different departments based on the evidence and push for the commitments made by the departments. So that's the next step we are going to do. And we are also doing a nutrition mapping across different departments of the government to see which are the interventions that they're doing and where are the gaps, so that that forms a framework for our nutrition policy that we plan to come out with, and also for the secretariat that I just mentioned to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We now have about a quarter of an hour for questions before the end of our session, which means we're going to have to be quite succinct, because I think there are probably a lot of questions out there. I'll be inviting them from the audience, from Twitter feeds, and I think what the best thing to do is to collect a few questions and then direct them to the panel. Now, one of the things that won't work is if every panel member answers every question all the way down the line. So I'm going to, if your question isn't directed at a particular panel member, I'm going to ask for a volunteer, but not share the question across so we can get more questions in. So please, questions from the audience. One up here first. I'll collect a few. Please. Could you say who you are and then follow with a succinct question, please?
Hi, I'm Marie Rumsby from Save the Children. So accountability has come up a number of times this evening as being key. We've also heard that there are several different initiatives working to address malnutrition, such as Nutrition for Growth, ICN2, post-2015. how can we ensure that these accountability efforts are harmonised so that we can effectively monitor progress? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Saw a hand up over here. Yes, Barry.
Barry Popkin.
Wait, there's a mic coming.
Excuse me, Barry Popkin, University of North Carolina.
Shout.
Shout. Okay, so this is for our DFID map. So in India, which is the center of half of our global stunting and wasting, we've had a 2-year or so major public works program before the elections. That's going to end with the new president. How are we going to deal with, on the national level, with getting them to continue with this kind of huge income generation in the rural areas, which even stopped rural migrant labor going from places like Orissa to, and Assam to the Punjab?
And one more. Down here, please.
Thank you. My name's Steve Lewis. I work for Results, and we took some parliamentarians to Cambodia and have just written this report, Undernutrition in Cambodia. So it's one of those sort of forgotten small countries. It's not like India, it's not Nigeria, but it's a typical country where there is good economic growth, and yet undernutrition rates are very stable. We're still, just like the example Michael gave about Zambia, we're talking 45% stunted children, and yet economic growth is 7% a year and so on. So the stakeholders in Cambodia asked me, they said, well, what new programs are coming out of Nutrition for Growth? So the concrete question for Nick and for Michael actually, a year ago I think we announced something called the Matching Fund for DFID and the Catalytic Fund. So the question is, when are more details going to come out from these about what will be the mechanisms and what will be the arrangements for those new funding lines? Thank you.
Great, so let's take some answers to those. We started with a general accountability question. Several different institutions are involved in this. Nutrition for Growth is just one initiative. How are we going to guarantee accountability across those? And then some specific ones on India that was directed to Nick, but I think Arti might want to have a comment on that as well. And one on Cambodia directed to Nick and Michael about the catalytic and matching funds. So perhaps I could start with, who'd like to start? Nick, would you like to start?
Okay, let me half answer the India question, and maybe others got a contribution to it. I mean, certainly the answer isn't that the UK government will fund it, and I think this is exactly the reason why we need to have accountability and advocacy, because this is a political issue. This is about the politicians in India deciding how to allocate their resources, and this is about people in India highlighting the importance of nutrition as one of those issues that they want to see funded. And that's exactly why we need the accountability reports. That's why we need to highlight what the state of the nutritional status is in India, to bring pressure on the politicians and to get people to highlight the issue. So I think it's entirely I think the accountability and the advocacy has got to be a big part of this.
On the catalytic and matching funds, anything to comment on that before we move on to Arti? You want to say anything about catalytic and matching?
Catalytic and matching funds. The UK government set out, was it 250 odd million pounds as a matching fund on a 1-to-1 and a 2-to-1 basis. And we are working with a number of people, including CIFF, including the Canadian government and others, to try and unlock that resource. The worst thing would be that we don't unlock it, that we don't take advantage of the funding. So it's about finding opportunities and talking to those who are bringing new money to the table and encouraging those to bring new money to the table to try and unlock that. So we're very much in the market to do that.
Michael, do you have a comment on that?
Sure, should I talk about that and then hand over to Arti
to
give us the answer on India? So on the catalytic fund, which CIFF is heavily involved in, we are spent a lot of time in the last year doing designs work and now well advanced in putting together the program with the World Bank as the anchor distributor. But the idea of the catalytic fund is to bring in new money to match it with some existing donors and to help leverage and mobilize the funds that are available through the World Bank, but also at the domestic level. I think the single most important thing to keep an eye on, we've kind of calculated that our resources, CIFF's resources, would be on the order of 2% of the total of what is needed to address the stunting challenge as set up with WHA. So all the donors together, CIFF plus Gates plus DFID plus World Bank, is only a small percentage of what is needed. So the big answer is political mobilization and getting the domestic resources mobilized in the right way. And I think that is a perfect point to hand over to Arti, who's shown great leadership in making sure that happens.
Thank you. To answer your question, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme may not be watered down. It might be restructured, but we can't say. But the good news is that the National Food Security Act is already enacted, which provides for right to food, minimum basic entitlements, so that's going to stay. And the new government has already demonstrated or stated its commitment to nutrition. And I think in the coming days, we are going to see a lot more action on that front.
Can I just add a word on the accountability, Jeff? Because I know that the Sun Civil Society Network is actively engaged in looking at this, looking at some of the commitments made under Nutrition for Growth last year. They're also looking at what CS themselves have made commitments to and what have been delivered against those commitments. I think the critical thing, as always, is that if this information is collected, it's put out there in the public arena so that we know what we can compare. And I mean, given some of the large commitments that were made last year by governments, I think, you know, we all of us have a responsibility to deal with specific governments and ask how they have lived up to what they've promised.
Thanks. Now, I'd like to hold that accountability question for the panel and collect a few more, and then let everybody come back to that, because I think that's a big question. I'll take two more questions. I've got a Twitter question as well. So move around the room. Up here in the middle.
Thank you. I'm Robin from the University of Sydney, and two disclaimers. I was born and raised on a beef and sheep farm, and I'm a veterinarian by training. So one of the things that really interests me when I listen to the public health nutrition discussions is that nobody really talks about diet and ideal composition. When I go around, people don't really understand what they should be eating. People don't seem to understand the difference between what men and women should eat. So my question is, I think we have to start with ourselves and that level of understanding. If people making decisions understood what a good diet is, maybe that would be better. So I'd really just love to hear your thoughts on how we improve our own understanding to deal with under and over obesity. Thank you.
Thank you. And a question way up at the back there.
Thank you. I'm Sabrina from Results UK. My question is, or a comment really, is 4.1 billion is a completely amazing amount of money to be pledged, and just want to encourage that money is dispersed quickly and effectively, because we have some really impressive impact targets, and obviously the quicker that money is dispersed, the larger impact we're going to have. But I think we also need to recognise that 4.1 billion is a great start, but it's still just a start. The Lancet series stated that it's going to take 9.6 billion a year, and it's 4.1 billion over 7 years. So we obviously have the 2016 Rio. Do we see this as a moment for repledging and further commitments? Because we've talked a lot about momentum, and that is an opportunity for momentum financially and politically as well.
Okay, thanks. So we'll get a question. Can we go down a couple rows to the question here, and then pick up one more, and then from here, and we'll take it there. So can you reach in, Charlotte?
Thank you very much. I'm Charlotte Dufour. I work with the Food and Agriculture Organization Nutrition Division, and my question is for His Excellency Mr. Jaguaribe. I would like to say on one hand, the agriculture sector obviously has a big role to play, but has been a little bit behind in taking ownership of the nutrition agenda. And while I must say it might not be visible from the outside yet, I'm seeing a lot of change amongst colleagues, agronomists, economists. It is taking time, and it is really, we see a growing number of countries where ministries of agriculture are slowly starting to look into nutrition. But it's hard, number one, and it's often very much still perceived as a donor-driven agenda. And so my question would be, how has that been the experience in Brazil, since you have a good example of, I think, ownership from a variety of ministries? What might be the levers, what might be the advocacy points we can use to build that momentum in agriculture? And I'd also please let's keep this momentum going long enough that the ownership can be strong enough to really sustain change. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question I'll take off of one of our Twitter responses, and it goes like this. Are there new ways to making nutrition more visible politically in Brazil and other countries? Are there new ways for making nutrition more visibly in Brazil, visible politically in Brazil and other countries? So we have a number of questions about understanding diet, about the particular experiences of Brazil, and more generally the whole opportunity to get ministries engaged in agriculture, and also about making nutrition more visible politically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by asking the ambassador to answer the question, and then open it to any comments that our panel might want to make, because that's probably going to be near our last round of questions. So please.
Well, thank you. You know, this is a fundamental question, obviously. We in Brazil, and I think everybody, believes that the only sustainable changes come from within. And if you're not going to have a different model through aid alone, that is a important component to start the model off. But the only sustainable thing is changes from within. For that, you need good practices and commitment. I think Brazil has provided some attractive models that can be used in countries with similar challenges, both from the technical point of view, from the social point of view, and from the political point of view, because these elements have to be taken into account if you're going to find sustainable solutions. And they need societal and model changes, which are not easy to undertake. Just a slight criticism here, if you allow me, we think that some of the aid models have been too much geared with what we call the preceptive role, political preceptive role, which we don't feel is helpful. We think they are not contributing to effective change internally in the countries where it's required. In many African countries, you cannot talk about good governance. You don't have the conditions for good governance. You need to start generating some capacity, especially in agriculture first. And of course, you have this something that comes along, but it is not a simple issue. But as I said, I think it needs to be done from within. I think many entities understand this well, and that is why, to a large extent, Brazil has been requested to participate, because it can help the model that we utilize to be more further down.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Anybody else like to comment? Everybody has an opportunity now in this last round.
Well, I just, and then I'll finish, obviously. I mean, I do think we're back to how to build support politically is a crucial issue in the year that we're facing, because next September 2015, really important decisions are going to be taken, which about the post-2015 world, which are going to determine policies for a number of years to come at national and international and national level. So I think it's up to this community in this room to muster all the arguments that the compelling arguments that there are, the arguments of science, the critical importance of investing in early childhood nutrition, the benefit that brings to human beings, to societies and to economies, and keep hammering home that message. And, you know, this is a time-critical moment for that message, for all of us to resolve that we're going to do whatever we can to influence whoever we can to make sure that that message gets embedded in policy in post-2015.
Thank you. So politics and accountability. Joe, would you like to say something?
I think that summed it up pretty nicely. I mean, I would say that you've got the underpinnings of something very unique here. One is just the agreed to policies that we know and the targets that were set and I think carefully laid out. I think the political underpinnings as well, the support demonstrated in 2013 for this issue is something that definitely can be continued to be tapped into. I think there is a next step, which is the popular engagement on this issue. And the more that some of the success stories, we've heard some fantastic successes and the ability to really scale simple interventions. I agree with Michael's point about the fact that we really need implementation and people to really put their muscle into making this happen. But the more we can accentuate some of the success stories that are possible, I think is critical. And 2016 is a fantastic moment to, I think, bring that together. So, you know, how we do that and how we sort of capture that creativity, I think, is something really important to build on with those other elements, on the policy, on the politics, and some of the specific targets.
Thank you. There's final comments.
Okay. I just wanted to capture Robin's point about diet and remembering to kind of keep that important and forefront, and connecting to Charlotte's point about the food community probably hasn't come as quickly forward on this as it needs to, and I think that we're just on the cusp of really making that happen. I think that connects with the ambassador's point quite nicely about building political commitment around the agriculture base and developing that. I do agree with Tom that the next year is getting those political arguments out clearly with a clear accountability framework. The question of how to bring the accountability all together of these various entities, we really hope that the report that Lawrence and Srinath and others are going to be leading on is going to pull together a lot of these disparate elements. And that's going to include, by the way, tracking the performance of the CSOs as well as the governments and various entities. So I think the accountability is critical, absolutely critical to raising awareness, driving forward accountability. And 2016 in Brazil is a critical moment for all of us. The question about can we get some more pledging, I think we're all looking to the government of Brazil to really lead us powerfully into a moment when we take this to a next level, based on the terrific experience that Brazil has to share with the rest of the world. So I think the next year leading up to the 2015 goals and the 2016 moment, a lot to do, but lots of tools which we know that work, and that's a good place to be.
Thank you. Anybody else like to make some final comments?
On Sabrina's point about it's not enough, the resources, absolutely it's not enough. But aid money is not going to fix it. And if you put the entire DFID budget, UK government budget into it, it wouldn't fix it. But I think that the point of the event last year was twofold. One was to raise the profile of the issue and get some momentum and political support behind it. But the other was to do it in a way to demonstrate that actually the solution is by engaging the science community. It's about learning from countries like Brazil. It is about unlocking the private sector. It is about getting governments to stand up and provide their own domestic resources to this issue. So it's not just an aid issue. We've got to collectively make the effort. And I mean, if you want to know where the UK government is, we've issued this Nutrition for Growth 1 year on little report here, which is our accountability in terms of what we've done. So have a look at that. But somebody asked a question about how do you change the politics. In some respects, I mean, I'm the last person you should ask in terms of how do we unlock the power of information, but ask my 17-year-old daughter, who will tell you what you have to do in terms of reaching new people through social media and using information in a different way to bring it to life and get it more accessed. And that's what we've got to start looking at as well. Not the good old standard reports that go straight on the shelf, but how can we get real-time information delivered in a compelling way that will grab people's attention.
Thank you. Great. Well, that's what we have time for in the way of questions tonight. Thank you for those. If there are more questions, we do have refreshments afterwards. I hope you'll nobble some of our speakers and do that. I'd like to thank our speakers, our panel, Ambassador, John, Lawrence, Srinath, for their presentations this evening. I think you'll agree they were all very, very direct and very influential in our thinking about how nutrition goes forward. So a round of applause. Thank you all. There is a momentum. Nutrition for Growth is alive. It's moving forward. We see some hills in the horizon. We see some big tasks in 2015 with the post-2015 agenda, 2016 when that race will hand the baton over to Brazil. Good luck to us all with that. I hope we'll have some very exciting reports on nutrition and other outcomes from Nutrition for Growth to help with that important political activity, and always the need to look at accountability as we go. So thank you for coming this evening. Do join us downstairs, and look forward to our discussions there.